At the end of October, a feeling of frustration respecting Guadalcanal pervaded both Japanese and American high commands. Allied ships afloat and aircraft aloft had failed in their efforts to seal off Guadalcanal from enemy access, or even to ensure the safe arrival of American reinforcements. Admiral Halsey, after 2 weeks as Commander South Pacific Force, felt exasperated. On shore, an alleged irresistible force, the Imperial Japanese Army had met a demonstrably immovable object, the United States Marine Corps. Something had to give soon. The break came in the great 3-day naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Each side decided to attack the other during November, each believing that his strength was sufficient to hammer the issue into a favourable and final shape. In Noumea, Admiral Halsey and staff prepared to accelerate the movement of supplies and reinforcements and at the same time disrupt the enemy's efforts. In Truk, Admiral Yamamoto completed an operation plan designed to secure supremacy in the Solomons. Characteristically, the American plan was simple and direct to bring in troops and supplies over airways and sea lanes, while the Japanese drew up an involved schedule of interdependent troop and ship movements. On 30th of October, anti-aircraft cruiser Atlanta and destroyers Aaron Ward, Benham, Fletcher and Lardner escorted to Guadalcanal the transports bringing General Del Valle's 155mm artillery, a welcome present for the Marines, who now had something with which to outshoot the Japanese pistol Petes. Shortly after sunrise on the 30th, while the big guns were being unloaded, the escort gave rousing bombardment support to a westward push of the Marines, which carried them to Point Cruz by 3rd November. For an hour on the morning of the 2nd, Shaw and Conyngham shelled Japanese shore positions between Point Cruz and the mouth of the Umasani River, with 803 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. But that night the enemy pulled his old trick of sneaking through the Sound to land 1,500 troops and some artillery near Coley Point, east of the American lines. This exploit appears to have produced a greater impression in America than in the South Pacific. The New York Times, in announcing it, included a warning against optimism by Secretary Knox. "It is a bitter, tough fight, and the whole Japanese fleet is involved." Yet, a few hours before this bad news reached the public, cruisers San Francisco and Helena and destroyer Sterret had drenched the new enemy positions with a destructive bombardment. The Marines followed up relentlessly, and by 9th November had practically exterminated the Coley Point force. Nevertheless, between 2 and 10 November, the enemy brought in 65 destroyer loads and 2 cruiser loads of troops to western Guadalcanal. Seabees worked overtime to repair and enlarge Henderson Field, and planes based there inflicted major damage on destroyers Takanami and Naganami on the 7th. On the same day, destroyer Lansdowne brought up 90 tons of ammunition for the Marines. Her unloading was interrupted at 9:29 when Majaba, an 1,800-ton Navy cargo ship anchored nearby, was hit by a torpedo from a Japanese submarine. United States destroyers in the vicinity were ordered to go get the offender, thought at the time to be a midget. Lansdowne joined in the search, which proved unsuccessful, then finished discharging her cargo and spent the afternoon bombarding Japanese shore positions east of the Metapona River. Next day, 8th of November, the Tulagi motor torpedo boat flotilla thrust a damaging but not fatal torpedo into destroyer Mochizuki at the cost of 2 PT boats hurt. And on the 10th, sweeper Southard sank submarine I-172 off Cape Recherche, San Cristobal. Times were not exactly dull, but neither were they momentous. Execution of American plans was still in the hands of Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, Commander Amphibious Forces South Pacific. Incorporated under his command were 2 task groups of transports loaded with troops, food, ammunition and aviation material, and a support group of cruisers and destroyers. 3 attack cargo ships, escorted by Rear Admiral Norman Scott in Atlanta with 4 destroyers, left Espiritu Santo 9 November and arrived Lunga Point on Armistice Day. The 2nd transport contingent, commanded by Rear Admiral Turner in Macaulay, sailed 8 November from Noumea and made Lunga on the 12th. Escorting Turner's 4 transports were 2 cruisers and 3 destroyers from the support group commanded by Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan. The rest of this group, 3 cruisers and 5 destroyers, rendezvoused with the transports off San Cristobal on 11th November. Intelligence reports indicated such a press of enemy shipping at Truk, Rabaul and the Shortlands that American commanders were not sanguine of discharging their own transports safely and at the same time preventing the enemy from landing heavy reinforcements. So Admiral Halsey sent a formidable team of troubleshooters to the area with Rear Admiral Kincaid in command. This was Task Force 16, comprising carrier enterprise, battleships, cruisers and destroyers. If the Big E, still under repair at Noumea from her bout off Santa Cruz, could not get there in time, the battleships and 4 destroyers would be detached for independent action under the command of Rear Admiral Willis A. Lean Washington. That is exactly what happened, and mighty fortunate that it did. Indirect support for Turner, Callahan and Kincaid was provided by the 24 submarines deployed in the Solomons, and by Rear Admiral Fitch's South Pacific planes in Espiritu Santo. General Geiger's 1st Marine, Air Wing at Henderson Field, gave direct support. Poised in the enemy base at Truk under Admiral Kondo were 2 light carriers, 4 battleships, 11 cruisers, and over 3 dozen destroyers to cover 11 high-speed Maras for a major movement of supplies and men into Guadalcanal on 14th November. Henderson Field would be heavily bombarded on the 2 previous nights. The operation plan indicated that Kondo anticipated stout opposition, and he was not disappointed. Intelligence on both sides of the enemy's intentions and composition of forces was fairly accurate. There was no question of surprise here. Admiral Turner's letter of instructions to Admiral Callahan, dated 10th of November, covered about everything that the Japanese could and did do. They, on the other hand, made a very close estimate of the forces that Halsey would employ. As the American transports steamed northward, D-Day dawned on the other side of the world in North Africa. An auspicious event for Allied fighting men everywhere, it was particularly welcome to those of the South Pacific, so long inured to delay and disappointment. Copies of the morning press were passed eagerly from hand to hand. Details of the African adventure became currency of conversation. If the Atlantic Fleet could handle the Krauts and their Vichy friends, surely Turner's outfit could take a round turn on the Nips. Admiral Scott's convoy hoped to elude long-range enemy air detection by passing north of San Cristobal, but the wily Japanese had sent to the Lower Solomons an I-class submarine carrying a seaplane, which sighted the force on 10th of November and manoeuvred maddeningly for 2 hours beyond anti-aircraft range. That meant trouble off Lunga. Accordingly, at daybreak on the 11th, when anchor chains roared down the hawse pipes of transports Zalin, Libra and Betelgeuse, the marine passengers lost no time landing, and their shore movement was expedited by a dive-bombing attack delivered by about a dozen enemy planes from Carrier Hio, then northwest of Guadalcanal. Ample warning from a coast watcher and from radar resulted in a vigorous anti-aircraft reception for the bat-winged Vals, few of which escaped. No ship was hit, but Zalin's hull was ruptured and flooded by near misses. She continued unloading until mid-afternoon, when, having discharged all passengers and half her cargo, she departed for Espiritu Santo, escorted by Lardner. Another attack later in the day by some 27 Bettys from Rabaul, flying too high for anti-aircraft fire to reach, dropped bombs around Henderson Field. Meanwhile, Turner's 4 transports had been pushing northward, closely covered by Callahan's support group. Turner, too, was snooped by a Japanese plane, and so ordered the troops ashore immediately upon their arrival at 5:40, November 12th, carrying only 1 unit of fire and 2 days' rations per man. During the previous midwatch, Callahan's group had searched Iron Bottom Sound and found it empty of enemy shipping. For protection of transports during the unloading, cruisers San Francisco, Portland and Helena steamed in a close semicircle, while Atlanta, Juneau, 11 destroyers and 2 large minesweepers afforded anti-submarine protection about 3 miles out. The first diversion that day was a submarine contact at 6, only 6 miles from Lunga Point. Vessels of the screen depth-bombed vigorously, but hit nothing. Pistol Pete then started whacking away at the transport area, much to the discomfiture of landing craft, but again hit nothing. Destroyer and cruiser fire and marine shore batteries silenced the big guns temporarily and then turned their attention to enemy beach positions to the west ward. The unloading proceeded at accelerated pace, anticipating an air attack. And at 13:17, November 12th, a coast watcher in Buin sent word that enemy bombers and fighters were coming. Admiral Turner immediately broke off unloading, got his ships underway, and formed anti-aircraft disposition. The transports were placed in 2 parallel columns of 3 ships each, while anti-aircraft guns on the support vessels bristled up like the hackles on so many Kerry Blues. Course and axis were set in the general direction of Savo Island. At 14:05, enemy planes were sighted circling low around the Ass's Ears, the eastern point of Florida Island. These were twin-engined Bettys getting into position for a coordinated torpedo attack. Presently they split into 2 groups so that a bracketing approach could be made. But Admiral Turner was a master at eluding torpedo plane attack. He turned his ships right so as to present their broadsides temptingly to the northern group of Bettys, who accepted the bait and charged in, skimming the surface. While the ships were pouring out anti-aircraft fire, Turner again changed course, this time to the left so that sterns were rudely presented to the onrushing ladies, and their torpedoes ran harmlessly parallel to the course. In the meantime, the other Japanese plane group to the southward was being pursued by wildcats from Henderson Field, which forced them to attack prematurely and disadvantageously. Again, Turner's captains combed the dangerous torpedo tracks. During the 8-minute period of action, anti-aircraft batteries averaged 1 elimination per minute, while the fighters accounted for all but 1 of the remaining Bettys. Other fighter planes disposed of a flight of dive bombers as well as 9 high-level bombers who had been making holes in the landscape around the flying field. On the debit side, there were 2 serious incidents. Destroyer Buchanan received so much topside damage from friendly anti-aircraft fire that she was ordered out of the area at nightfall. A wounded enemy plane deliberately crashed cruiser San Francisco on the after-control station, knocking out a fire control radar, disabling an anti-aircraft gun director, and inflicting casualties on some 50 men, including the executive officer, Commander Mark H. Crowter. The wounded were transferred to President Jackson, but Commander Crowter, eager to return to duty at the earliest moment, insisted on remaining on board, a decision that shortly cost him his life. A tense calm followed the afternoon's elimination shoot. As Turner's ships steamed back to the unloading area through floating remains of downed planes, they realized that the enemy had just begun to show his hand. 5 cruisers of varying capabilities and 11 destroyers of assorted origin were available to chop it off. An abundance of aircraft intelligence, routed to all flag bridges during the day, indicated the convergence of heavy surface forces north of Guadalcanal that night. Morning observation revealed 2 battleships or heavy cruisers, 1 cruiser and 6 destroyers, 335 miles to the northward. Another group of 5 destroyers lay less than 200 miles to the north-northwest. In mid-afternoon, 2 carriers and 2 destroyers were reported 265 miles to the westward. That was bad enough, and Admiral Turner suspected that it was not all. Since no troop ships had been sighted, he guessed that the enemy was intent on attacking the American transports, or else bombarding Henderson Field and adjacent troop positions. Since 90% of their lading was already on the beach, these vulnerable targets could be sent away, but a bombardment could be countered only by a night battle. In his appraisal, Turner listed enemy strength as 2 battleships, 2 to 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 10 to 12 destroyers, obviously too large a bite for Callahan's 2 heavy and 3 light cruisers and 8 destroyers. Yet with Kincaid's carrier battleship force too far away to help, there was nothing else to be done but for Callahan to block, and block hard. Admiral Turner's decision was embodied in a dispatch to Admiral Callahan, which confirmed his earlier written orders. Transports would retire, and Callahan's support group, after shepherding them safely to sea, would return to Guadalcanal that night and strike enemy ships present. Turner left Callahan to work out the tactics of this desperate effort. Dusk of 12th of November found the 4 transports and the 2 cargo vessels of Scott's group escorted by the damaged Buchanan, destroyers Shaw and McCalla and minesweepers, Southard and Hovey, hauling out for Espiritu Santo, where they safely anchored on 15th of November. Rear Admiral Callahan was now on his own, faced with an urgent situation. His 2-starred flag now flew in the ship he had commanded 6 months earlier before serving on Gormley's staff, austere, modest, deeply religious, a hard-working and conscientious officer who possessed the high personal regard of his fellows and the love of his men, who called him Uncle Dan. Callahan had reached the acme of his career. There was something a little detached about this man, since his thoughts were often not of this world, something too that recalled the chivalrous warriors of other days. One could see him in the role of Don Alonso de Aguilar, or of dark-haired Duthmaruno, Fingal's second in command. Near us are the foes, Duthmaruno. They come forward like waves in mist, when their foaming tops are seen at times above the low-sailing vapour. Included in Callahan's force were anti-aircraft cruiser Atlanta, flying the flag of Rear Admiral Norman Scott, and 2 of his destroyers. Scott, the victor of the Battle of Cape Esperance, was junior to Callahan, who thus became officer in tactical command. Callahan ordered his group to assume battle disposition B1, a snake-like column, the van consisting of destroyers Cushing, Laffey, Sterrett and O'Bannon, the centre of cruisers Atlanta, San Francisco, Portland, Helena and Juneau, and the rear of destroyers Aaron Ward, Barton, Monson and Fletcher. This disposition, resembling the old line of battle of sailing ship days, was chosen because it appeared to have worked well under Scott at the Battle of Cape Esperance. A long column helped one to navigate restricted waters and facilitated communication between ships. Unfortunately, the 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers that mounted the latest search radar were not placed in lead positions. Anti-aircraft cruiser Atlanta, with inferior radar, steamed ahead of flagship San Francisco, and the rear destroyers were in no position to join the van in a torpedo attack. At 22, after seeing the transports safely away, Callahan reversed course and passed back through Lengo Channel into Iron Bottom Sound. A 9-knot easterly breeze scarcely rippled the surface. The stars shone brightly, and jagged flashes of lightning over the island's fitfully illuminated low-lying clouds. The new moon was vanishing below the dark horizon. Sailors peered from darkened bridges, waited in crowded plotting rooms, and sweated in stifling engine rooms, wondering what the score would be. Few of these ships had operated together before that afternoon, yet no intelligence of enemy movements was distributed to commanding officers, and no battle plan was issued. Enemy forces were heading southward, planning to leave Santa Isabel Island on their starboard hand, pass south of Savo, and round upon an easterly bombardment course parallel to the Guadalcanal shore. The battleships and destroyers which had departed Truk 9th of November, and the additional destroyers which left Shortlands on the 11th, were the elements reported by American air patrols on the morning of the 12th. At 15:30 that day, they rendezvoused 70 miles north of Indispensable Strait and became Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's raiding group, consisting of 2 battleships, light cruiser Nagara, and 14 destroyers. Their mission was to knock out Henderson Field completely. Shell hoists were crammed with thin-shelled, quick-fused bombardment projectiles. Special flashless powder was on hand to assure concealment during action. If challenged on the surface, the destroyers could brush off the intruder with torpedoes. The core of Abe's formation was a bombardment unit of 2 battleships, Hiei leading Kirishima, with 6 destroyers and Nagara screening. On both advanced flanks rode destroyers prepared to deal with motor torpedo boats. Both the disposition chosen and his lack of armour-piercing projectiles indicate that Abe was not looking for a major surface encounter. This miscalculation cannot have been caused by lack of intelligence, because the admiral had been informed that 9 United States cruisers and 7 destroyers were near Guadalcanal. It must rather have been based on the assumption that the Americans, as usual, would be gone with the sun, leaving Dai Nippon to prowl the Sound at will. The first deviation from plan occurred at midnight. Abe's raiding group entered a squall northwest of Savo Island, and the admiral reversed course, apparently fearing lest the weather proved too thick in Iron Bottom Sound for a shore bombardment. Upon obtaining a favourable weather report from Japanese headquarters on Guadalcanal, he put about again for Lunga, but he had lost 40 minutes and set forward to 1:30 the time for the bombardment to commence. In manoeuvring, the right flank destroyers Asagumo, Murasame and Samidare fell out of position and were now far back on the starboard quarter instead of on the port bow of the battleships. It was now Friday the 13th, last day of life for 8 ships and many hundred sailors, including 2 American admirals. Early in the midwatch, a Helena radar operator detected a suspicious blip on his scope. Then appeared 2 traces that were neither friendly ships nor neutral land masses. The report went out at 1:24. Contacts bearing 312 and 310, distant 27,000 and 32,000 yards. Obviously one was a group of ships screening another 5,000 yards behind it. 3 minutes after this first contact, Admiral Callahan ordered his 13-ship column to change course 2 points to starboard, to course 310 degree. Apparently he desired a head-on clash rather than the more subtle runaround accompanied by torpedo launchings from the flanks. At 1:30, Helena informed all ships that the enemy disposition was on their port bow, distant 14,500 yards, steaming at speed 23 knots on course 105 degree. Opposing forces were closing at a rate of over 40 knots, and as the range decreased, the initial American advantage of radar vanished. Fire control men, intent on the complicated controls of range keepers, watched the relentless spinning of the range dials, heard the drone of the range talker's voice, range 13000, range 12000, wondering why no word came to let fly fish or commence gunfire. For 10 long minutes their questions remained unanswered. Course was changed to due north, speed upped to 20 knots. On board San Francisco, Admiral Callahan, blind for want of adequate radar, was continually and urgently calling on his seeing-eye dogs, Helena and O'Bannon, for vital ranges, bearings, courses and composition. Yet this same voice radio, TBS channel, was the tactical control circuit. Imperative directions for course, speed and gunfire had to be sandwiched between information requests. The outlets of the squawk box, voice radio on the ship's bridges, delivered a confused medley that baffled listeners and fast typists alike. The fast-approaching Japanese did not listen in on this circuit. They were unaware of an enemy in the Sound. But they were not to be caught with defences down. In anticipation of the scheduled shore bombardment, stocky gunners waited in their turrets while torpedomen, secondary battery gun crews and searchlight operators stood alert at battle stations. Without radar, Admiral Abe realised that any surface action would be quick, close and decisive. Inexorably, the range closed. Commander Stokes of Desdiv 10, embarked in van destroyer Cushing, suddenly sighted Japanese destroyers crossing ahead, port to starboard, at the uncomfortably close range of 3,000 yards. A flash radio report was passed down the line as Cushing's skipper, Lieutenant Commander Parker, turned left from a northerly heading at 1:41 in order to unmask his torpedo batteries. His quick turn avoided collision with the enemy, but resulted in a pile-up of the van, in which every ship struggled to keep station while swinging to the new course 315 degree. Atlanta, heavier than the destroyers, had to swing hard left. "What are you doing?" asked Callahan over voice radio. "Avoiding our own destroyers," answered Captain Jenkins. The ships seen by Stokes were destroyers Udachi and Harusame, whose skippers may have been startled but were certainly not asleep. By 1:42, a minute after first sighting, the entire Japanese force knew of the contact. Surprise was lost, and the American delay in opening fire gave Admiral Abe's ships 8 good minutes to prepare for action. The United States ships were doubly confused by the sudden left turn and the resulting press of voice radio transmissions. Nobody could be certain whether reported target bearings were true or relative to the reporting ships. Nobody knew which target to take under fire or when. Commander Stokes could stand it no longer. "Shall I let them have a couple of fish?" he asked. Permission was granted, but by this time the enemy destroyers had scudded into the darkness. Finally, at 1:45, Admiral Callahan gave the word, "Stand by to open fire." The prologue was now over and the principals in place. Americans confused, Nipponese surprised. Through the darkness, Japanese night glasses picked up the loom of ships almost within their own formation, Atlanta's high superstructure standing above the low destroyer silhouettes. At 1:50, Japanese searchlight shutters clicked open, beams shot out, feeling right and left. One, probably from Akatsuki, quickly came to rest on the port wing of Atlanta's bridge, bathing the whole superstructure with the kind of light that sailors rightly fear. The cruiser's gunnery officer shouted 2 orders: "Commence firing! Counter-illuminate!" The range was a scant 1,600 yards, with solution already set on the range-keeper. The cruiser's 5-inch guns spewed forth a stream of shells which extinguished the offending light, but not quickly enough. While Atlanta sent salvo after salvo crashing into the nips on both bows, they and their sister ships concentrated on her. Enemy shells crunched into the misnamed Lucky A. One of them eliminated Admiral Scott, all but one of his staff, and others on the bridge. Simultaneously, from San Francisco came the long-awaited order. Odd ships commence fire to starboard, even ships to port. Atlanta's participation in the battle was brief. Japanese destroyers, ever ready to exploit torpedo opportunities, dispatched several salvos at the confused American column. 1, perhaps 2, hit Atlanta. Their explosion lifted her bodily from the water, then set her down, shuddering and crippled. In the plotting room, fire control men watched the needle on the pitometer log slide down the scale until it rested against 0. Atlanta was dead in the water, and the battle scarce begun. The ship's mascot terrier, misnamed Lucky, whimpered pitifully in a corner of the damage control station, while the officer in charge telephoned vainly for reports from damaged areas. From now on, Japanese and American ships mingled like minnows in a bucket. It is impossible to reconstruct their tracks. We can only relate what happened to each. Van Destroyer Cushing sent several salvos screaming after a destroyer to starboard, but within 2 minutes received shell hits amidships, which severed all power lines and slowed her down. Her bow was pointing almost due north when her skipper sighted Hiei on his port beam, on a collision course. Using hand steering control and what little way remained, he swung Cushing right and, by local control, fired 6 fish at the enemy battle wagon less than half a mile distant. None hit Hiei, which was also the target of destroyer and cruiser gunfire. But she didn't like it and turned slowly away to the westward. Cushing had only a few moments to exult like David. A probing searchlight beam picked her out, and enemy gunfire reduced her to a sinking wreck in short order. Laffey, directly astern of Cushing, also entered a disastrous argument with Hiei, passing so close that collision was barely averted. Her torpedoes, launched at too short a range, failed to arm and bounced harmlessly off the battleship's sides. Topside machine gunners sprayed the pagoda-like bridge with 20mm and 1.1 bullets as Hiei passed, shooting. Then 2 large-caliber gun salvos and a torpedo in the fantail put Laffey out of action for all time. She was promptly abandoned, the third to go. Many swimming survivors were terminated when the burning hull exploded. Destroyers Sterett and O'Bannon, respectively 3rd and 4th in column, had better luck. The former, as an odd-numbered ship, ordered action starboard and took an enemy vessel under rapid fire at 4,000 yards range. Although the Haiyai fracas on her port had rendered visual fire control difficult, radar and early fire-igniting hits on the target solved the problem. 3 minutes after Sterrett had opened fire, an enemy salvo found its mark in her port side aft, disabling her steering gear. This was followed by a hit on her foremast which destroyed the radar. But Sterrett and her wiry little skipper, Commander Jesse G. Coward, were still full of fight. Manoeuvring her with the engines, Coward turned his attention to Hiei and pumped out 4 torpedoes at 2,000 yards range. Simultaneously, O'Bannon was getting in a few licks. She had opened fire when the first searchlight burst out, and so continued throughout the battle. The illuminating Japanese took a pummeling from her guns before O'Bannon turned on Hiei, then some 1,200 yards on her port bow. Commander Wilkinson, in the midst of a manoeuvre to avoid collision with Sterrett, ordered fire on the big battleship. At that moment came a puzzling order from Admiral Callahan. "Cease firing own ships." O'Bannon's skipper checked fire momentarily and then launched 2 carefully aimed torpedoes at Hiei. He thought they had scored, but actually they either failed to hit or did not explode. The range was so short that the battleship was unable to depress her guns sufficiently to hit back. As her 14-inch salvos shrieked harmlessly over their heads, O'Bannon's sailors had the pleasure of seeing this enemy ship of the line completely enveloped in sheets of incandescent flame. A moment later, O'Bannon sheered left to avoid the sinking Laffey's bow and tossed life jackets to survivors as she passed. Torpedo wakes crossed her bow. Suddenly, an enormous underwater explosion jolted the ship, disrupting light and power and rattling the teeth of all on board. This quake may have been Laffey's explosive death rattle, or it may have been an enemy torpedo exploding at the end of its run. Admiral Abe had already disposed of a light cruiser and 2 destroyers, but his position on the flag bridge of Hiei, cynosure of American gunfire, blinded him to the actual progress of the battle, and he ordered a change of course in order to get clear. The American column had actually penetrated the centre of his formation between his van destroyers and between his 2 battleships. This was not according to book, and the Admiral did not like it. While Hiei was bearing the brunt of American fury, her sister battleship Kirishima, about 800 yards on the flagship's quarter, was dishing out 14-inch punishment, but receiving only near misses in return. She was nicked but once during the entire engagement by an 8-inch shell. Both battleships turned left in compliance with the retirement order, Hiei so slowly that she was rapidly left behind, but she had not yet been torpedoed and was in not too bad a shape. Flagship San Francisco, 6th in the American column and astern of Atlanta, had entered the fray promptly, taking under fire an enemy vessel on her starboard beam less than 2 miles distant. For illumination, she used 5-inch starshell, fired to burst above and beyond the target. The unblinking beam of a searchlight, originating on her starboard quarter, wavered and then settled on her, and the illumination of American ships astern served to silhouette her to the enemy. After delivering 7 hefty salvos, San Francisco shifted to a target described as a small cruiser or a large destroyer. 2 full main battery salvos were pumped into the vessel, setting her on fire throughout her length. It will be recalled that Atlanta was now dead in the water and ahead of San Francisco. The crew of Atlanta believed that she was the victim. How else can one explain Admiral Callahan's order to cease fire? Before he gave that order, however, the flagship's main battery control officer had sighted Hiei and contributed some well-placed salvos toward the devastation of that ship. When the cease-firing order took effect, San Francisco was the first to suffer. Kirishima on her starboard hand dealt out heavy blows. Another enemy ship on her starboard quarter employed searchlight illumination and gunfire to good effect. A destroyer darting down her port side raked the superstructure. Steering and engine control were temporarily lost, and as she slowed down, an avalanche of shellfire from 3 different ships snuffed out the lives of Admiral Callahan and his staff, of Captain Cassin Young, and of nearly every man on the bridge. At this juncture, cruisers astern of San Francisco rallied to her support. Portland, 7th in line, had closed firing keys when the enemy illuminated. Her shells located a starboard hand target, whose return fire registered but 1 hit, which wounded the executive officer. 5 minutes after the battle's start, Captain Lawrence Dubose received the cease-firing order, but disregarded it except for an incredulous inquiry addressed to the flagship. "What's the dope? Did you want to cease fire?" Callahan had time to answer affirmative and to order a course change to the North Ward. Portland checked fire briefly while turning, then picked up a target 3 miles to starboard and commenced gnawing away at it with her turret guns. A Japanese torpedo tore through the water toward her. A terrific wallop rocked the cruiser as the explosion ripped a huge chunk from her stern, bending the structure so that projecting hull plates acted as an unwanted auxiliary rudder, and she made an involuntary complete circle. As she came out of it, Hiei loomed up in her sights, range 4,000 yards, and Portland let her have it from both forward turrets. This concluded the evening's main battery performance for the Sweet Pea, as her crew called this happy ship. Helena, next astern, was favoured by fortune. Opening fire at the same instant as the ships ahead of her, she directed her tracers at the inquisitive searchlight on her port beam some 2 miles away. Enemy shell splashes reared up in ugly gouts astern, but Helena received only minor superstructure damage. During the next few minutes, Captain Hoover made strenuous efforts to avoid the damaged ships ahead, while his guns shifted from target to target. Almost simultaneously, his 6-inch main battery lashed out at a ship that was pummeling San Francisco. His 5 inches went after a destroyer on the starboard quarter, and his heavy machine guns worked over a ship of unfriendly contour only 3,000 yards distant, probably Nagara. When the enemy's retirement opened the range, bullets from Helen hastened him on his way. Juno, last cruiser in column, fired along with the rest of the task force during the hectic quarter hour between 1:48 and 2:03. In common with other ships, she had difficulty in identifying targets. Callahan's cease-firing order belayed a brief spraying of Helena. An enemy torpedo sundered Juno's forward fire room with a shock which put the ship completely out of action, dead in the water and probably with a broken keel. From that moment, her main concern was to clear out and keep afloat. Bringing up the rear, and thus late for the initial slugfest, were destroyers Aaron Ward, Barton, Monson, and Fletcher. Captain Robert G. Tobin, the squadron commander who flew his pennant in the first named, was handicapped by lack of orders and an ineffective radar. His opening ranges were considerably greater than the side-scraping distances at which the van destroyers fought, and the jumbled state of the column rendered target selection and station-keeping almost impossible. Aaron Ward opened up on a target 7,000 yards on her starboard bow, discharged 10 salvos, and then checked fire because friendly cruisers fouled her range. Commander Gregor was forced to stop and back engines to avoid collision with a ship ahead, probably Helena. 10 minutes elapsed before he could feel certain that an enemy target was in the optics, and then San Francisco charged into his line of sight. A target showing unfamiliar recognition lights sharp on the starboard bow was next taken under fire at a 1.5 mile range, and firing continued until the ship appeared to explode and sink. Aaron Ward then used enemy searchlights as points of aim. She received 1 hit in the director, which occasioned a shift to local control of gun batteries. Destroyer Barton, commissioned as recently as 29th of May, had a total combat life of exactly 7 minutes. She opened fire, launched 4 torpedoes to port, stopped to avoid collision, and, when almost dead in the water, received a torpedo in the forward fire room, which was followed almost instantly by another in the forward engine room. She broke in 2 and sank in a matter of seconds, taking with her all but a handful of the crew. Monson, her conning party eagerly listening to the jabber of the voice radio, trailed Barton. She had lost the use of her fire control radar during the afternoon airfight and was forced to rely on radio information and optics. Her knowledge of the situation was slight, but her interest was great, particularly after a torpedo passed directly under her keel. Monson fired a 5-torpedo salvo at a battleship on her starboard bow, then turned her attention to another vessel 2 miles on the starboard beam, launching a spread of 5 more torpedoes. The 5-inch guns, meanwhile, went after targets on the port side, while the 20mm guns raised havoc on the top side of a destroyer, a quarter of a mile to starboard. Starshell began to burst over and around Monson, lighting up the ship like a nightclub floor show. Lieutenant Commander McCombs, believing the starshell to be friendly, switched on his fighting lights, and the click of that light switch was the death knell of his ship. 2 blinding tentacles of light grasped her, a deluge of explosives followed, torpedoes hissed by. Some 37 shell hits reduced Monson to a burning hulk. Destroyer Fletcher, despite her station in the very rear of the column, had excellent information from a superior search radar. When the enemy first illuminated Atlanta, Commander Cole triggered his firing keys at the offending ship, then some 5,500 yards on his port bow. Next, observing that many other ships had chosen the same target, Fletcher shifted to a more distant target and had the satisfaction of starting some bright blazes. The order cease firing caused her to check momentarily and then resume firing at a third target still farther back in the enemy formation. 8 minutes after the first shot, Fletcher sailors witnessed the sudden disintegration of Barton and the riddling of Monson. Now that the column was in complete disorder, Commander Cole decided to leave this cluttered area, make another evaluation and return to launch his yet unused torpedoes. Aided by a constant flow of information from the radar room, he threaded his way through the maelstrom of friends and foes, turned south, bent on 35 knots, and rounded up to a firing position ahead of the enemy. Torpedo wakes swirled under and around her, gun salvos bracketed her, but Fletcher had a charmed life. She emerged without even her paintwork scratched. 4 bells of this sinister midwatch had struck during these 15 minutes of raw hell. A literally infernal scene presented itself to the participants. The struggle had deteriorated into a wild and desperate melee. The greenish light of suspended starshell dimmed the stars overhead. Elongated red and white trails of shell tracers arched and crisscrossed. Magazines exploded in blinding bouquets of white flame. Oil-fed conflagrations sent up twisted yellow columns. Dotting the horizon were the dull red glows of smouldering hulls, now obscured by dense masses of smoke, now blazing up when uncontrolled fires reached new combustibles. The sea itself, fouled with oil and flotsam, tortured by underwater upheavals, rose in geysers from shell explosions. By November 13th, the main issue had been decided by Admiral Abe's order to Hiei and Kirishima to turn left and steam north. Henderson Field and its precious plains were safe for that night at least, but nobody on the American side knew it. Fighting continued with little respite after the battle wagons retired, Hiei to the south of Savo, Kirishima to the north. A short lull gave Cushing opportunity to fight fires on board, but just as they were brought under control, several enemy salvos came her way. The flames then took charge, and finally, at 3:15, with magazines in volcanic action, the skipper ordered abandon ship. Lafay was already on the iron bottom. Sterrett, with steering gear disabled, encountered destroyer Udachi some 600 yards on her starboard bow at 2:20 and launched 2 torpedoes followed by gunfire which took her apart. But shortly after, Sterrett was hit by 14-inch shells and forced to retire southeastward, slowing down periodically to reduce the windage on the flames. Commander Wilkinson in O'Bannon decided, since the scene was utterly confused, to haul off to the southeastward in an effort to locate friend or foe. At 2:15 he sighted a smoking vessel on the port bow, but wisely withheld torpedo fire on what later proved to be San Francisco. Thinking that enemy transports might have entered the Sound, O'Bannon turned south and investigated the shoreline. St. Christopher, St. Barbara, and the luck of the Irish must have been with plucky O'Bannon on this fearful night. Atlanta's fighting men by 2 were mere spectators, a status which they had neither time nor inclination to enjoy. Their ship was ravaged by more than 50 large-caliber shell hits, holed by torpedoes and consumed by fire. Survivors found devastation behind every bulkhead and in almost every compartment. Below decks, men groped in complete darkness through acrid smoke, and sloshed heavily in oily waters on flooded decks. Cursing and coughing, they laboured to seal hull ruptures, succour the many wounded and bring fires under control. Oil and seawater made a nasty, slippery slush through which one could move only on hands and knees. The spud locker amidships had burst open, strewing the decks with potatoes. No joke to groaning men who slipped on the treacherous tubers. Muzzles of useless guns drooped silent over the motionless deceased. 7 out of the 8 5-inch turrets had been hit. All but 4 of the machine guns were smashed. Flames ate greedily into the superstructure, belching out as burning ammunition detonated. Shadowy figures, the only living part of this macabre setting, moved perilously back and forth as bucket brigades or to jettison the cumbersome weights which threatened to capsize the ship, or to carry the wounded to improvised dressing stations. Admiral Scott was passed away, but Captain Jenkins and his executive officer, Commander Campbell D. Emery, were spared serious injury. They were able gradually to establish communications with the little knots of survivors around the ship and to direct a coordinated effort to save Atlanta. Gasoline handy-billies were rigged to fight fire. A damage control party worked to get one fire room back into operation. The remaining guns were manned. The injured were taken to comparative safety aft. As the battle drew to a close, San Francisco's topsides were in almost as bad shape as Atlanta's, but 3 circumstances saved the flagship from annihilation. The close range had prevented the enemy from depressing his guns sufficiently to score hits below the waterline. Thin-skinned bombardment shells, fatal to human lives and damaging to superstructure, had been deflected by armour. She had suffered no torpedo hits. On the navigation bridge, Lieutenant Commander Bruce McCandless, communications officer, found himself the only able-bodied survivor. In Central Station, Lieutenant Commander H.E. Shonland, acting First Lieutenant, learned that he had succeeded to command. Realizing that his knowledge of damage control was vital to the ship's survival, he elected to lead the fight against the 25 fires then raging, and ordered McCandless to con the ship out of harm's way. That he did very well, skirting the coast of Guadalcanal. Portland, with her warped stern, continued to steam in tight circles for the remainder of the night. Captain Dubose at one time counted 9 burning vessels in the Sound. Helena ceased firing at 2:16 and, except for brief searchlight scrutiny, received no more attention from the enemy. Captain Hoover, unable to contact either Scott or Callahan and believing his to be the senior undamaged command, called all ships and at 2:26 ordered them to follow him and retire via Sealark Channel. Juneau got way on by the end of the midwatch and moved toward Indispensable Strait. Meantime, Captain Tobin's 3 remaining destroyers of the rear were acting individually. Aaron Ward, with guns in local control, lashed out at enemy searchlights that were guiding salvos her way. She cleared out after being pierced by 9 medium-caliber shells. The damage was cumulative and progressive, so that by 2:35 she lay dead in the water with a flooded engine room, and spent the rest of the night in efforts to get way on. Monson burned and exploded with such fury that she was hastily abandoned. The crew, clinging to life rafts, watched their ship flame and erupt throughout the remaining hours of darkness. Fletcher, the apparently untouchable Shadrach of the American task force, was now in an excellent position to re-enter the contest with torpedoes. A large target was selected and radar commenced tracking as the ship stalked her prey. The enemy vessel, on an easterly course, was shooting to the northward, probably at her friends, when Fletcher dispatched 10 fish on a 3.5-mile run at 36 knots. Having shot her bolt, Fletcher retired in the general direction of Sealark Channel. On the enemy side, it is probable that most torpedo tubes were emptied during the first 10 minutes. At any rate, after 2, the Martian display diminished rapidly. Hayai steered an erratic northwesterly course, limping from damage to steering and communication systems and loss of firepower. She had taken over 50 topside hits. Destroyer Akatsuki, one of the forward screening vessels, had gone down. Udachi of the advanced flank, Emerging from a penetration run through the American forces, underwent as ever explosion at 2:20, which stopped her dead some 5 miles south of Savo Island. 3 destroyers had been hit but not stopped. Kazuchi, forecastle gun damaged, Murasame, forward boiler room out, Amatsukaze, minor scars. These 3 retired to the north in company with undamaged ships. Samidare took off Udachi survivors and followed them later, and the patrol unit of 3 destroyers stood by the stricken battleship. The mountains of Guadalcanal turned from black to purple and then to lush green. Sailors on crippled warships of both nations stood by their damaged guns, grimly aware that between ship and ship no quarter would be given. Early birdmen could see 8 crippled ships scattered without order between Savo Island and Guadalcanal. 5 were American: unsteerable Portland, shattered Atlanta, immobile Aaron Ward, burning and abandoned Cushing and Monson. The rising sun was still flying on rudderless Hiei and her loyal protectors, and on flaming and abandoned Udachi. It was inevitable that more compliments would be exchanged. Portland, still churning in circles, embraced Udachi 12,500 yards distant, with 6 salvos. Enough of these 36 projectiles hit to produce a magazine explosion which completely erased the destroyer, a cheering sight to many a swimming American. Hiei sent 4 2-gun salvos careering down the 13-mile range to Aaron Ward. The third straddled but did not hit. Fortunately, the Marine Corps aircraft which promptly appeared on the scene proved so interesting to Hiei that she laid off the destroyer until tugs could tow her out of range, eventually to an anchorage in Tulagi Harbour. On board Atlanta, all efforts were concentrated on saving the ship. Captain Jenkins, wounded painfully in the foot, urged his bedraggled seamen to superhuman efforts. First, it was necessary to get the pumps going to counteract the continual seepage of water. Apprehensive of beaching off the enemy-held shore of Guadalcanal, the captain ordered the port anchor walked out and issued small arms to all hands. Wounded and non-essential ratings were sent ashore in Higgins boats hastily provided by the Lunga base. Even after 9:39, when tug Bobolink had taken her in tow, Atlanta shot at a Japanese Betty, which ventured too close. The seamen of Bobo Link, rendered aggressive by previous experiences, machine-gunned every dark head they saw afloat until Captain Jenkins begged them to desist lest mistakes be made. By 14. The cruiser was anchored off Kukum, but she could not be kept afloat. No salvage facilities were available. She was listing heavily to port, and the enemy was expected again that night, so the crew was ordered to scuttle the old girl with a demolition charge. Atlanta went down 3 miles off Lunga Point shortly after dark on Friday evening, the 13th. Cushing and Monson continued to burn, but did not sink until late in the afternoon. The water around them was blanketed with debris. At daylight, 3 gallant sailors boarded burning Monson to rescue 8 helpless wounded and place them in a life raft. Rescue craft from Guadalcanal ploughed through wreckage and oil, picked up friends and were evaded by foes who had been indoctrinated not to accept rescue. All day, Portland continued her efforts to recover steering control. A score of Higgins boats nosed her bow, huffing and puffing in a vain struggle to offset the torque of the bent stern. Every conceivable manoeuvre and gadget were tried. Sea anchors improvised of canvas and garbage cans were streamed. Finally, Bobolink, after leaving Atlanta, pushed Portland's starboard bow so vigorously that she was able to crawl along on a steady course. Sweet Pea finally anchored in Tulagi Harbour at 1, November 14th. The American vessels, which had retired from the hotspot around Savo, found themselves at dawn in a formation proceeding southeasterly down Indispensable Strait. Captain Hoover of Helena, now senior officer present, took charge of San Francisco, Juneau, O'Bannon, Sterrett and Fletcher, 3 of them lame ducks. Zigzagging through a smooth sea at 18 knots, they set course for the New Hebrides. In order to provide anti-submarine protection, Fletcher and Sterrett were placed 4,000 yards ahead of the heavy ships. As O'Bannon's sound gear had been damaged by the previous night's underwater explosion, she was sent ahead to transmit a radio message to Admiral Halsey. At 9:50, Sterrett made a sound contact and delivered an urgent depth charge attack with indeterminate results. An hour later, this task force touched the nadir of its fortune. Helena was steaming 1,000 yards ahead of San Francisco. Juno was 1,000 yards on the latter's starboard beam. Submarine I-26, cruising at periscope depth, drew a bead and fired a spread of torpedoes. 2 of them shot past San Francisco, but she, with no means of rapid communication left, could not broadcast the alarm. Straight and true, 1 enemy torpedo travelled toward Juno, and at 11:01 detonated against her port side under the bridge. Horrified sailors in San Francisco saw the light cruiser disintegrate instantaneously and completely, sinking with apparently no trace except a tall pillar of smoke and a little debris. Nobody waited to look for survivors. A flying fortress, attracted thither by the force of the explosion, was informed of the disaster and asked to relay a rescue request to Admiral Halsey's headquarters. Unfortunately, this message never got through. Of more than 100 men who miraculously survived the eruption and who clung pitifully to the flotsam that marked their ship's end, all but 10 perished. 3 paddled their raft to a small island where friendly natives and a European trader brought them back to life, and a Catalina carried them home. Another PBY rescued 6, Ballard picking up the sole survivor of 1 raft on 20th November. Almost 700 men, including the 5 Sullivan brothers, went down with Juno or passed away in life rafts. So ended the wildest, most desperate sea fight since Jutland, one that recalls the Anglo-Dutch battles of the 17th century. Ship losses were fairly well balanced, 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers as against 2 destroyers, and a battleship so badly damaged that airmen could sink her next day. Casualties on the American side were many times those of the enemy. But the Japanese bombardment mission was completely frustrated. Yamamoto admitted as much by relieving Abe and depriving him of any further sea command. Callahan, on the other hand, completed his mission. He saved Henderson Field from a bombardment which might well have been more serious than the bombardment of mid-October, and certainly would have stopped the American air operations, which next day disposed of 11 troop-laden transports. Thus, in the end, all mistakes were cancelled out by valour. While the shells that were to strike him down were being loaded into enemy gun breaches, Admiral Callahan called out over voice radio, "We want the big ones," meaning Japanese battleships. His men stopped one. On the following night, Admiral Lee consigned another to the iron bottom. "Let none deny praise, glory, and honour to those who fell on Friday the fierce 13th, with 2 great seamen and gallant gentlemen, Daniel J. Callahan